I spent 32 years of my life knocking on doors that should never have been opened. 32 years carrying a brown leather briefcase under my arm, filled with magazines that promised answers to questions I'd forgotten to ask myself. My name is Richard Thompson, I'm 55 years old, and for more than half of my existence, I believed I was saving people from an imminent apocalypse when, in fact, I was slowly drowning in a sea of rules that shifted with the tide of convenience. The first time I smelled the acrid scent of doubt was one Saturday morning when my 17-year-old daughter looked at me through her tears and asked why God cared so much about the length of her skirt, but apparently didn't care that Brother Patterson, a respected elder in our Manchester congregation, had placed his hand on her thigh during a service meeting. In that moment, as I opened my mouth to give an answer I had memorized like a parrot, I realized my tongue was paralyzed. The words simply wouldn't come out because, for the first time in 3 decades, I actually heard what she was saying. There are truths that explode like grenades in the middle of your living room. There are secrets that ferment in the shadows of the kingdom halls, covered by rehearsed smiles and hugs that last exactly 3 seconds. No more, no less. Always 3 seconds, because exaggerated displays of affection were seen as worldly. Everything had a measure, a rule, a Bible verse conveniently interpreted to justify control. When I finally took off the blindfold I had so carefully tied around my own eyes, I realized I wasn't seeing the light. I was seeing the darkness that had always been there, disguised as spiritual illumination. What I'm about to tell you is not a story of youthful rebellion or someone who wanted to live a life of sin. It is the story of a man who woke up too late to save his marriage, his family, and nearly his own sanity. If you still believe that the organization is the only way to salvation, close this video now. Because once you see the cracks in the foundation, you can never again pretend the building is sound. And I'm going to show you every single crack I found, one by one, until you understand why I can no longer pretend I was building something divine when, in fact, I was only stacking bricks of lies. Before we dive into the deep, cold waters of my journey, I need you to do something for me. If this story is striking a chord inside you, if you recognize the scenarios I'm about to describe, or if you simply want more people to hear these accounts that get stuck in the throats of thousands, hit that subscribe button on this channel. I'm not asking for vanity or numbers on a screen. I'm asking because every subscription is one more voice joining the chorus of those who decided that the truth is worth more than the approval of an organization. Give this video a like if you believe that stories like mine deserve to be told, even when they challenge structures that many consider sacred. And here is my special request, in the comments, write down which city you are watching from. I want to know if in Auckland, in Sao Paulo, in Toronto, or in Tokyo, there are people going through the same solitary awakening that I did. I want you to know that you are not alone, that on the other side of the screen there is someone who understands the feeling of the ground disappearing beneath your feet when you question something that should be unquestionable. I grew up in a family where religion wasn't just a belief, it was the air we breathed. My mother was baptized in the 60s, right around the time the organization promised that 1975 would be the year of Armageddon. She sold the family home, convinced my grandfather not to get expensive medical treatment because, after all, the end was just around the corner. Why spend money on health when paradise was marked on the calendar? When 1975 passed and the world kept spinning, no one apologized. The narrative silently shifted, like a prestidigitator who switches cards without you noticing the hand movement. I was baptized at 15, not because I had a deep understanding of the implications of that symbolic dip, but because all my friends in the congregation were getting baptized. There was an invisible but palpable pressure, like a weight on your chest that only lifted when you walked up to that platform and answered yes to questions you barely understood. My parents cried with joy. The elders congratulated me with firm handshakes and approving looks. I had just signed a contract I couldn't break without losing everything I knew. In the years that followed, I became what they called an exemplary brother. Regular pioneer at 18, ministerial servant at 23, elder at 31. Every step on this spiritual ladder felt like an achievement, a confirmation that I was on the right path. I conducted meetings, gave talks, counseled young people, participated in judicial committees where we decided the spiritual fate of people who had committed what we considered grave sins. I was a well-oiled cog in the machine, and for a long time, that made me feel important, necessary, chosen. The first crack appeared in a way I would never have expected. I was at an elders' meeting on a Tuesday night, after the congregation had already left. There were 6 of us men sitting on plastic chairs in a back room of the Kingdom Hall, discussing the case of a sister who had been seen entering a movie theater. The film in question was a romantic comedy, nothing R-rated, but someone in the congregation had seen and reported it. We spent 45 minutes debating whether we should call her in for a pastoral conversation or if it was already a case for forming a judicial committee. Brother Hendricks, a white-haired elder who had been in the organization since before I was born, argued that movie theaters were worldly environments where satanic influence was strong. He cited a Watchtower article from 1987 that discouraged frequenting such places. Brother Morrison agreed, adding that even if the film itself wasn't immoral, the atmosphere of the theater, the people around, the commercials before the session, all contributed to weakening our spirituality. I jotted everything down in a notebook, as I always did, trying to capture every argument so that our decision would be fair and based on Bible principles. It was then that Brother Wallace, the youngest of the elders present, asked a question that echoed in the silence of that room like a gunshot. He asked where exactly in the Bible it was written that movie theaters were forbidden. Hendricks looked at him with that expression I knew well, that mixture of surprise and disapproval that arose whenever someone questioned an established point. He replied that it wasn't about being literally written, but about applying Bible principles to our modern life. Wallace insisted, with a calm that made me uncomfortable, saying that we were then creating rules that didn't exist in the scriptures and presenting them as divine will. The meeting became tense in a way I had never experienced before. Morrison tried to close the subject by saying we should trust the direction of the faithful and discreet slave, the central leadership of the organization, which had already spoken on worldly entertainment. Wallace didn't argue further, but the silence that followed had a different weight. I felt as if I had just witnessed something I shouldn't have seen, as if a curtain had been slightly pulled back, revealing that behind the decisions that affected entire lives, there were just men with opinions, fears, and personal interpretations. That night, I returned home and couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling of my bedroom, listening to my wife Margaret's heavy breathing next to me, and a question hammered in my head like an insistent woodpecker. How many other rules that I had followed so religiously were just human interpretations disguised as divine commands? How much of my life had been shaped not by God, but by a group of men in New York who had never been in my house, met my family, or understood my struggles? I tried to push those thoughts to the back of my mind, where a collection of doubts I had learned to ignore over the years already resided. Doubts about why the organization had changed its position on organ transplants, first prohibiting, then allowing, condemning thousands to unnecessary deaths in the meantime. Doubts about why we treated disfellowshipped members as if they were spiritual lepers, ignoring them completely even when they were our own children. Doubts about the thousands of failed predictions about the end of the world that had marked the organization's history since its founding. But doubts were dangerous. Doubts were the seeds of apostasy. There was an unofficial but universally known saying among us, trust Jehovah and his organization, and when in doubt, study the publications more. The problem was, I had studied. I had read every Watchtower, every Awake, every book published by the Society over the last 20 years. And the more I studied, the more the cracks appeared, fine as hairline fractures at first, but slowly expanding like spiderwebs on a condemned wall. The sister from the movie theater ended up being called in for a conversation. She cried, apologized, promised never to do it again. We, the elders, left that meeting feeling like shepherds who had protected a sheep from an invisible wolf. But I left carrying something heavier than the leather briefcase I took to meetings. I left carrying the question I didn't want to ask but could no longer avoid, were we really protecting people, or just keeping them trapped? The following months were an exercise in cognitive dissonance. During the day, I smiled, greeted the brothers and sisters, gave my talks with the rehearsed conviction of someone who had memorized the lines well. But at night, when the house was silent and only the hum of the refrigerator filled the void, I found myself in front of the computer, typing questions into Google that a faithful elder should never ask. I read accounts from ex-members, stories of institutional abuse, analyses of doctrines that pointed out inconsistencies I had spent my entire life ignoring. Every click was an act of betrayal. Every article I read was a hammer blow to the foundation of my faith. The organization taught us that any negative information about it came from apostates, people controlled by Satan whose sole mission was to destroy our faith. They told us not to read, not to listen, not to question. But human curiosity is stronger than fear once you've started seeing the cracks. It's like trying not to look at a road accident. You know you shouldn't, but your eyes are inevitably drawn to the wreckage. The moment that truly broke something irreparable inside me happened on a rainy Thursday in November. I was in the hallway of the Kingdom Hall, adjusting the microphone for that evening's meeting, when I saw Sister Janet Cooper enter accompanied by her 14-year-old daughter, Emma. Janet had deep dark circles under her eyes, as if she hadn't slept in weeks. Emma kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Something was terribly wrong. 3 days later, I was summoned to an urgent elders meeting. The case was delicate, they told me. Janet had reported that Emma had confessed to having an inappropriate relationship with a boy from school, a worldly person, and that they had committed sexual immorality. My heart sank. Emma was a quiet, studious girl who answered at meetings with a soft voice and always helped clean the hall. This seemed completely out of character for her, but I knew everyone was capable of falling, which was why we needed constant vigilance. The Judicial Committee was scheduled for the following Tuesday. There were 3 elders, myself, Hendricks, and Morrison. Emma entered the room with her mother, and for the first time in years of participating in these meetings, I felt my stomach churn. She looked even smaller sitting in that plastic chair, her hands trembling as she held a paper tissue that was already soaked. We began with a prayer, asking Jehovah to guide us to make the correct decision, and then we started the questions. The protocol was clear. We needed to establish the facts, understand the extent of the sin, and assess the level of repentance. Hendricks took the lead, asking questions I had heard hundreds of times but that day, sounded different. He asked exactly what had happened, how many times, where, which body parts had been touched. Emma was crying so hard she could barely speak, and every sob was a knife twisting inside me. Morrison meticulously took notes, his face a mask of professional seriousness. It was then that she said something that changed everything. Through tears, Emma mentioned that she had told Brother Patterson about what was happening, 3 months earlier. She had gone to him after a meeting, asking for advice because she was confused, because the boy from school was pressuring her and she didn't know how to handle it. Patterson, the same elder my daughter had mentioned months ago, had talked to her. But instead of reporting to the other elders or alerting the parents, he said it would stay between them, that she should pray more and avoid the boy, but that it wasn't necessary to involve anyone else yet. The silence that fell over the room was deafening. I looked at Hendricks and Morrison, expecting them to react, to ask the obvious questions. Why hadn't Patterson reported this? Why had he kept a situation that clearly needed intervention a secret? But neither of them said anything. Morrison continued his notes. Hendricks cleared his throat and redirected the questions back to Emma's behavior, her choices, her responsibility for what had happened. When Emma and Janet left the room so we could deliberate, I exploded. I asked why we weren't discussing Patterson's failure to perform his duty as an elder. Hendricks looked at me with that tired patience of someone who has been through this before and said that was a separate matter, that first we needed to resolve Emma's situation. Morrison agreed, arguing that we couldn't let problems with an elder divert our attention from the sin before us. I insisted, but it was 2 against 1, and in the end, my voice was just a powerless echo in a room that had already made its decision. Emma was disfellowshipped. 14 years old, lost, confused, a victim both of a manipulative boy and a system that was supposed to protect her but instead chose to punish her. The following week, she tried to sit through the meetings, as was expected of disfellowshipped individuals who wanted to repent, but no one could speak to her. Her own mother greeted her with a cold nod. The young people who were her friends looked away when she passed. I watched it all and felt like I was watching a ritual sacrifice where the victim was offered up on the altar of congregational purity. Patterson's case was quietly dealt with in another meeting, which I was not invited to attend. He received a private reprimand, lost a few privileges temporarily, but remained an elder. There was no public announcement, no real consequences. The justification they gave me later, when I insisted on knowing, was that he had made an error in judgment but had no bad intentions, that we all make mistakes, that we needed to be merciful to our brothers. That same mercy, apparently, did not extend to a 14-year-old girl. That night, sitting in my car in the empty Kingdom Hall parking lot, I realized I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't pretend I was serving God when I was only serving an organization that protected its reputation above its sheep. The cracks that had started as fine lines were now abysses, and I was falling into them with nothing to hold on to. Margaret noticed something was wrong before I could even put it into words. We had been married for 28 years, and she knew every one of my expressions, every change in my voice's tone. One Saturday morning, when I should have been getting ready for field service, she found me sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee that had been cold for hours. She pulled up a chair, sat next to me, and simply waited. She didn't ask, she didn't pressure. She just waited until I was ready. When I finally started talking, it was as if a dam had burst. I told her about Emma, about Patterson, about the elders' meeting where we debated whether a sister could go to the movies. I told her about the nights I spent reading things I shouldn't read, discovering things I shouldn't know. I told her about the growing feeling that I had wasted decades of my life building a house on sand, and that now the tide was coming in and I realized there was no foundation at all. Margaret listened to everything in silence, her hands cupping her own coffee mug as if she needed the warmth to stay anchored to reality. When I finished, exhausted from talking so much, I waited for her reaction. I expected her to be horrified, to scold me, to remind me of the vows we made when we were baptized. But instead, she said something that shocked me more than anything else on that entire journey. She said she also had doubts. She said that for years she had been swallowing questions she didn't have the courage to ask out loud. We spent that entire Saturday talking, something we hadn't done in years. Our communication had become functional, superficial, limited to meeting schedules, service commitments, and basic household decisions. But that day, I rediscovered the woman I had married, the real person behind the mask of an exemplary sister. She told me she had always had problems with how the organization treated women, how we were kept silent, without a voice in decisions, without the power to question men even when they were obviously wrong. Margaret also spoke about our daughter, Melissa, who was now 19 and barely spoke to us since she had been disfellowshipped 2 years ago. Her sin. Starting to date a boy without the elders' approval. He wasn't a witness, he was what we called worldly, and that was unacceptable. She was warned, reprimanded, threatened with disfellowshipping if she didn't end the relationship. When she chose the boy over the organization, we lost the right to have a daughter. Not by our own desire, but by the rules we swore to follow. For the last 2 years, Melissa had called a few times, always briefly, always with a voice full of hurt and confusion. Margaret answered secretly from me, spoke for a few minutes, and hung up before I noticed. She confessed this that Saturday, tears streaming down her face, saying that every time she hung up the phone she felt like she was choosing God over her daughter, but that lately she had been wondering if it was really God who was asking for this choice or just men who had turned their interpretations into divine laws. We decided together that we needed to investigate further, but carefully. The organization had a term for people like us, mentally diseased with the illness of apostasy. If anyone found out we were questioning, we would be summoned for a judicial committee. All our friends, all the people we had known for decades, would be instructed to completely shun us. It would be like socially dying while still alive. So we decided to be strategic, go slowly, research in secret. We bought a used laptop that we kept hidden in the guest room closet. At night, after we were sure no one would visit us, we spent hours researching. We read about cases of sexual abuse within the organization that had been systematically covered up, about the two-witness rule that required two people to witness abuse for it to be considered valid, as if sexual predators typically committed their crimes with an audience. We read about lawsuits in various countries, about million-dollar indemnities paid to victims, about leaked internal documents that showed the leadership was more concerned with protecting the organization's reputation than with protecting children. We discovered that the organization had been an associated member of the United Nations for almost 10 years, the same UN that they publicly called the wild beast of the Book of Revelation. When they were discovered, they quickly cancelled the association and tried to minimize the fact, but the documents were there, irrefutable. We read about all the failed predictions of Armageddon, 1914, 1918, 1925, 1975, the 1914 generation that was not supposed to pass away before the end and that had its definition changed several times until it completely lost its original meaning. Each discovery was a brick being removed from the structure of our faith. Margaret and I took turns between moments of anger, sadness, and strange relief. Anger for having been deceived. Sadness for the time lost. Relief for finally understanding that the guilt we carried for never being good enough was not our fault, but a characteristic of the system. A system that keeps you always insufficient, always needing to do more, always one step away from displeasing God, always dependent on the organization to tell you if you are saved or condemned. On one of those nights, Margaret asked me what we would do with all this information. Could we ignore what we discovered and continue living the lie? Could we leave and lose everyone we loved? There was no easy answer. But there was one certainty: I could no longer look at Emma sitting alone in the Kingdom Hall and pretend that was divine justice. I could no longer participate in judicial committees where we destroyed lives in the name of rules that changed with every edition of the magazine. I could no longer preach from door to door offering people a salvation that I myself no longer believed existed in that format. The decision to leave didn't come in a dramatic moment of revelation. It came slowly, like the sun gradually rising on the horizon until suddenly you realize it's already day. Margaret and I started small. First, we stopped commenting at meetings so often. Then, we started missing some midweek meetings, always with valid excuses: headache, work fatigue, unavoidable commitments. The elders noticed. Pastoral calls began to arrive, offers to talk, questions about how we were doing spiritually. What truly precipitated everything was when we finally decided to look for Melissa. We couldn't bear the distance anymore, the artificial silence between us and our daughter. One Sunday afternoon, instead of going to the meeting, we drove to her apartment across town. We knocked on the door without warning, our hearts beating like war drums. When she opened it and saw us, her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, hope, fear. She invited us in like we were polite strangers. We spent 3 hours in that small but welcoming apartment. Melissa was doing well. She had a job she loved at a bookstore, was going to college at night, and was engaged to the same boy who had caused her disfellowshipping. He was kind, respectful, clearly in love with her. We met her friends, normal people with normal lives who weren't waiting for the end of the world at any moment. She laughed, something I had forgotten the sound of. Laughed for real, not the restrained, appropriate laugh we cultivated at meetings. When we told her about our doubts, about what we had discovered, she cried. Not from sadness, but from relief. She said she had spent 2 years thinking that she was the one who was wrong, that she had disappointed God in us. Discovering that we were questioning the same things, that we also saw the problems she had seen, was like being given permission to breathe after years of holding her breath. We apologized for treating her the way we did, for choosing rules over our own daughter. She forgave us with a grace we didn't deserve. The news that we had visited Melissa spread through the congregation like wildfire. Jehovah's Witnesses have an information network more efficient than any intelligence agency. In less than 48 hours, 3 elders were knocking on our door. Hendricks, Morrison, and a younger elder named Peters who had recently been appointed. They asked to come in, their expressions a mixture of concern and determination. We knew what was happening. This was the beginning of a process that would end with our disfellowshipping. We sat in our living room, the same place where we had received hundreds of pastoral visits over the years, where we had studied with new interested people, where we had prepared talks. Hendrik started with a prayer, then asked directly, was it true that we had visited our disfellowshipped daughter? I confirmed that it was. He asked if we understood that this was violating the biblical principles of association. I replied that I understood what the organization taught, but that I doubted if it truly reflected what the Bible said about family love. The conversation deteriorated quickly. Morrison started asking questions about our meeting attendance, about our participation in field service. Peters, eager to prove his worth as a new elder, asked if we had been exposed to apostate material. That was the question that broke the final barrier. I looked at Margaret, she nodded almost imperceptibly, and I told the truth. I said yes, that I had researched, that I had discovered things that questioned many of the organization's teachings, that I could no longer continue pretending I believed in something that my conscience rejected. The silence that followed was absolute. Hendricks closed his eyes, as if he were in physical pain. Morrison stopped taking notes and just looked at me with something that looked like pity. Peters, on the other hand, looked almost triumphant, as if he had just caught a confessing criminal. They explained that a judicial committee would be formed, that we would be officially summoned, that we would have the opportunity to repent and return to the correct path. I thanked them for the visit and walked them to the door. When I closed the door behind them, Margaret was standing in the middle of the room, her arms crossed, her face pale but determined. She said we would not attend the judicial committee. We would not give them the power to judge us, to decide our spiritual worth based on rules we no longer believed in. If they were going to disfellowship us anyway, they could do it without our presence. It was the most liberating and terrifying decision we made together. The announcement came 2 weeks later, on a Thursday night. We weren't there to hear it, but we knew exactly what was said because I had heard that same announcement hundreds of times over the years. The brother on the platform, in a neutral, official voice, would have said, Richard Thompson is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. 7 words that erased 32 years of my life in the organization. No explanation, no details, just the announcement that instantly turned Margaret and me into dead people to everyone we knew. The days that followed were the loneliest of my existence. My phone, which used to ring constantly with invitations to service groups, requests for help with talks, casual conversations with brothers and sisters, went completely silent. The people we had considered our family for decades simply vanished. I crossed paths with members in the supermarket and they literally turned their faces away, as if I were invisible. A sister who had been a bridesmaid at our wedding saw Margaret in a store and hurried away, as if the simple act of being in the same aisle could contaminate her. My mother, who was 83 at the time, called once. She cried on the phone, saying I had broken her heart, that she didn't understand how I could throw away the truth, that she was praying for me to come to my senses before it was too late. I tried to explain, tried to say I still loved her, that my doubts were about the organization and not about her. She hung up mid-sentence. That was the last time I spoke to her. 3 years later, when she passed away, I was not informed until after the funeral. My brothers, both elders in their respective congregations, decided my presence would be inappropriate. There were moments, especially in the first weeks, when I considered going back. Not because I believed, but because the weight of the loneliness was crushing. The organization had been my complete identity for more than half my life. All my social references, all my friendships, all my structure of meaning was intertwined with it. Removing it was like ripping out your spine and still expecting to stand up. Margaret had the same thoughts. We talked about it on the dark nights, pondering if it was worth maintaining our intellectual integrity if the price was this devastating isolation. What saved us was Melissa and the small community of ex-witnesses we started meeting through online support groups. We discovered we were not alone, that there were thousands of people around the world who had gone through the same painful awakening. They understood the loss in a way no outsider could. They knew what it was like to wake up on Saturday morning and feel that phantom anxiety that they should be in field service. They knew the residual guilt that arose even after they stopped believing, that voice in the head that whispered that maybe they were wrong, that maybe Armageddon really would come and they would be destroyed. Slowly, painfully, we began to rebuild our lives. I made friends with neighbors I had always kept at a distance because they were worldly. I discovered that they were good, ethical, loving people, without needing a set of religious rules to guide them. Margaret went back to school, something she had abandoned when she got married because the organization discouraged higher education as a waste of time in a world about to end. She enrolled in a community college and discovered a passion for psychology. Her first dissertation was on mind control in high-control religious groups. Melissa gradually reintroduced us into her life, with the caution of someone who has been deeply hurt and fears being hurt again. But with time and patience, we rebuilt a relationship that is now stronger and more genuine than it ever was when we were in the organization. She got married in a beautiful garden on a summer afternoon, and for the first time in years, I danced. I danced at my daughter's wedding, something I had never done because the organization considered dancing worldly and potentially sensual. And as I twirled Margaret around the makeshift dance floor on the grass, I realized I had recovered something I didn't even know I had lost: spontaneity, joy without guilt, life without the constant weight of never being good enough. Not everything was easy. Depression came in waves, especially in the first few years. There were moments when I woke up in the middle of the night with panic attacks, convinced I had committed the unforgivable sin, that I had become an apostate and was condemned. Therapy helped. Finding a therapist who understood religious trauma was essential. She helped me understand that what I had experienced was not just a change of religion, but an exit from a system of mind control that had shaped every aspect of my thinking for decades. Deconstructing that, learning to trust my own judgment again, was a long and often painful process. Today, sitting here recording this story for you, 7 years have passed since that Thursday my name was announced from the platform. 7 years since I officially became dead to hundreds of people I once called family. 7 years since I began the most difficult and most important journey of my life, the journey back to myself. And if I could go back in time and speak to that 55-year-old Richard, sitting in the elders' room debating whether a sister could go to the movies, I would say one thing: the cracks you are seeing are not signs of weakness in your faith, they are signs of strength in your conscience. I do not share this story to attack people who are still Jehovah's Witnesses. My mother was one until her last breath, and she was a good, sincere woman who genuinely believed she was serving God. Thousands of witnesses are good people doing the best they can with the information they have. But I share this story because information is power, and many people within the organization do not have access to the complete information. They are taught from an early age that any questioning is dangerous, that doubts come from Satan, that investigating is apostasy. They live in a carefully constructed bubble where only one narrative is allowed. If you are watching this video and feel that knot in your stomach, that discomfort that comes when something you've always believed begins to unravel, know that you are not alone. Thousands have walked this path before you. Will it be difficult? Yes. Will you lose people? Probably. Will there be nights when you question if it was worth it? Absolutely. But on the other side of this journey there is something the organization can never offer: genuine freedom to think, to question, to doubt, and to discover your own truths. And I can tell you, after 7 years, that this freedom is worth every tear, every loss, every difficult moment I faced along the way. Because for the first time in 55 years, when I look in the mirror, I see not an obedient servant of an organization, but a free human being, with all the complexities, doubts, and possibilities that implies. And that, my friend, is priceless.